Outside of a Minnesota Vikings victory, I don't think there's anything much sweeter than watching a divisional opponent like the Green Bay Packers struggle against the Philadelphia Eagles in a playoff game. Now, I'm very careful, and I think I have a different perspective on a divisional opponent like the Green Bay Packers losing in the playoffs. Because last year, when the Packers blew it against the 49ers, it was enjoyable to watch. I'm glad that they lost. I'm glad that Jordan Love choked and the Green Bay Packers fell apart. All of those things brought me much joy from watching the NFL. But I wasn't overly excited because when I think about it on the full scale, the Green Bay Packers made the playoffs, so they were there. They gave themselves an opportunity, and the Minnesota Vikings did not. And when you really think about those two things, the Packers made the playoffs and the Vikings did not last year. Well, Packers fans could easily look down on Minnesota Vikings fans for not making the playoffs. So Vikings fans really don't have any room to make fun of Packers fans in that situation. What are we going to do? Make fun of them for making the playoffs and losing a playoff game? Well, they can just turn towards us and say, well, at least we made it to the playoffs. And that's an easy, quick burn because based on what accomplishment are Minnesota Vikings looking and turning towards the Packers and looking down upon them? They were looking down upon us because we weren't even there. So I'm not celebrating that one too hard. However, when the Packers lost to the Philadelphia Eagles, we are so close to celebrating that loss to the extreme. Because if the Minnesota Vikings advance tonight past the Los Angeles Rams, the Minnesota Vikings would have made it farther than the Green Bay Packers with Sam Darnold as QB1. The Packers last year being looked at as this uprising team, one of the youngest in the league, Jordan Love, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, stellar defense, a young, brilliant coach, Matt LaFleur, and they made it just as far as the Minnesota Vikings this season so far. But if the Minnesota Vikings capitalize on their matchup against the Los Angeles Rams tonight, well, they are going to go farther than the Packers, and then we can celebrate the Packers' loss to the Philadelphia Eagles as hard and as much as we want, because then the Vikings made it farther than them. I think I have a little different perspective on it. You know, people are so quick to celebrate the Packers losing, which is so easy to do because they are our divisional foe. They are our divisional rival. But if you make it just as far as the Packers, it's not as sweet. If the Packers make it farther than the Minnesota Vikings, it's certainly not as sweet. But if the Minnesota Vikings can advance past the Packers to the divisional round, they beat them twice in the regular season this year, well, then it becomes sweet. Then it becomes a cherry on top, because the Minnesota Vikings beat them twice in the regular season and made it farther than them in the playoffs. And I did a video a long time ago about the Green Bay Packers. Can't remember when this was. It was 5 months ago, it says, on my YouTube and podcast channel. And my title was Minnesota Vikings Should Not Fear Jordan Love and the Green Bay Packers. And, you know, when they post something like that, Green Bay Packers fans are going to be all up in arms about your take and about your opinion, calling you all of these different names and calling you an idiot, calling you all these things. And I got some good comments just to read through. 5 months ago, I'm sorry, didn't Jordan Love make the Vikings call him daddy in week 17? LMAO. tell me you're filthy casual without telling me you're filthy casual, LMAO. Maybe they shouldn't fear them, but it's not a matter of should or shouldn't. It's a matter of when. I mean, nobody cares if they're afraid, but you're looking down the barrel again, having to face the best QB in the league 2 times a year. Just beat him twice. And he just threw 3 picks against the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, in the Packers' defense, the final interception that Jordan Love threw to whoever he was throwing the ball to, final 2 minutes of the game was practically over anyways. It would have taken a miracle. But yeah, you score that touchdown to get an onside kick. It gives you an opportunity. It gives you an opportunity to kick an onside kick. And that's one of the rules the NFL needs to change. They need to change the onside kick to an offensive opportunity going forward on 4th and 15, 4th and 18, something like that, to make it more interesting and captivating than an onside kick that has like a, 5% chance of being successful. But that was defensive pass interference on the Philadelphia Eagles defender, and the Packers should have had the ball at the 1. That is a prototypical pass interference in the NFL. Underthrown ball, wide receiver attempts to come back and get it. Linebacker is not turned around to look at the ball, and he completely collides into the Green Bay Packers wide receiver. I don't know how that wasn't called. That is the easiest pass interference call, because it wasn't a small tug on the jersey. It wasn't a small push or grab or whatever. The guy completely ran over the wide receiver as he was trying to come back and get the ball. So the Packers got screwed on that one. But in all reality, it was an uphill battle, even if that was called a defensive pass interference. Similar to the Minnesota Vikings earlier in the year. Now, everyone wants to complain about Sam Darnold and the face mask against Los Angeles Rams. That wasn't called. But in all reality, the Minnesota Vikings probably were not winning that football game. You're at your own 1 or 2 yard line, and you got to drive all the way down the field, no timeouts, 1:45 left, and get a 2-point conversion and beat the Rams in overtime. That's asking a lot for a Sam Darnold at that point in the season that wasn't necessarily clicking on all cylinders. The Minnesota Vikings, they were winning games, but they just weren't quite rolling as they were like they were at the end of the season before the Detroit Lions game. So it was an uphill battle for the Packers, even if that was called. But it was a terrible missed call. Jordan Love, 20 for 33, 212 yards, 0 touchdowns, 3 picks, a QBR of 37.2, and a passer rating of 41.5. It's going to be fascinating because if the Minnesota Vikings do beat the Los Angeles Rams and advance farther than the Green Bay Packers, the Minnesota Vikings matchup will be the Philadelphia Eagles. And there was some questions surfacing yesterday on whether the Vikings would rather face the Detroit Lions or the Philadelphia Eagles. And it is a tough one to answer because the Eagles are good. They are a tough matchup. And the Minnesota Vikings have had terrible history against them. And, people come with this theory of, it's hard to beat a team 3 times in a year. It's hard to beat a team as many times as the Lions would have to beat the Vikings, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. But at this point in time, I think I'd rather face the Eagles than the Detroit Lions. It really doesn't matter because if you beat the Eagles, you're going to have to face the Lions anyways if they beat the Commanders, which is most likely to happen. So you got to get through both teams most likely. So it doesn't really matter who you play first because you got to beat them both. But the Packers lost to the Eagles 22-10. And I'm having a miniature celebration right now. I'm glad that they lost. But am I all out excited right now? No. I will be if the Vikings beat the Eagles tonight because I don't think there's anything more sad than a team celebrating so hard that another team lost because your own team doesn't really have anything to celebrate. And that's really what's been true for Minnesota Vikings fans in the past. Like last year, the Packers lost to the Niners. And I was glad that they lost, but I wasn't overjoyed. People get overjoyed because the Minnesota Vikings weren't in the playoffs. But I see that as, well, we have nothing to celebrate from our own team because our team stinks and isn't good enough. So we need to find our joy in the Packers' playoff loss. That just doesn't sit right with me because they at least made it to the show. They at least gave themselves a chance to advance. The Minnesota Vikings were nowhere to be seen. They didn't make it to the play. They didn't make it backstage. The Packers were backstage hanging out with the band, hanging out with the crew. The Vikings didn't even get tickets. So this year is different. The Vikings got tickets. They got to the play. But right now they're sitting in the same seat as the Packers. They got to win tonight. They got to win. And then they can get backstage and hang out with the band and hang out with the crew. So it's a big game tonight. Advance to the divisional round with Darnold, Kevin O'Connell. His contract extension really depends on what the Minnesota Vikings do in the playoffs this year. The number, that is, he's going to get extended regardless. But is that number 5 years, $60 million? Is that number 5 years, $45 million? Based on the playoffs, that number will change for him and Sam Darnold. So this is a huge game. Massive implications for the Minnesota Vikings tonight against the Los Angeles Rams in Arizona. So it's a big one. It's a big one. And if they win, well, then we can be overjoyed that the Packers lost because we have our own team to be excited about and not just the Packers loss. That's how my mind works. That's where my mind goes. Thank you for watching this podcast and for making this podcast a part of your day. Hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, and follow this podcast if you're listening on Apple or Spotify or wherever you are listening to this podcast. Thank you for going on this podcasting journey with me.